The trade war between the US and Canada is heating up today after Canada posted retaliatory tariffs, some as high as 50% on US goods. This is after the US imposed a 50% tariff on some Canadian goods. But you might be asking yourself, how did we even get here? How did this trade war even start? So over the last few weeks, Canada and the US have been engaged in trade talks in light of escalating tensions that have honestly started since the beginning of the current administration's second term. This is important because both Canada and the US are significant trading partners with one another, with the US being Canada's #1 trading partner and Canada being the US's #2 trading partner. So since January of 2025, the current administration has been making repeated threats to Canada's economy by threatening to institute import tariffs, and has also gone as far as to say that Canada could become the US's 51st state. Now, this is all coming to a head as the negotiations to renew the US-Canada-Mexico agreement, otherwise known as the USMCA, which was negotiated by this current administration in their first term, was expected to start in July. Canada has stated that it would like to renew the USMCA. However, the US is dragging its heels a little bit. It's stated that it hasn't wanted to renew the pact for the previous negotiated allotted time, and it's kind of not offering a whole lot of details. While these talks were beginning at the beginning of July, the current president threatened to impose tariffs as high as 50% on many Canadian goods, including those that were previously exempted from tariffs due to the USMCA, claiming that Canada unfairly discriminates against US automobiles, dairy, and alcohol. Now, you might be asking yourself, Sarah, how is the current administration imposing these tariffs on Canada? I thought the Supreme Court declared that unconstitutional. Well, he's using a mechanism that the Supreme Court has not yet declared if it's unconstitutional. He's using something known as a Section 338 tariff, which is essentially allows the president to impose tariffs of as high as 50% on imports from countries that quote unquote discriminate from US businesses. Now, unlike other forms of tariffs that we've talked about, these require no investigation by the Commerce Department, nor do they have any limits about how long they can be imposed. What's interesting about Section 338 tariffs is they've never been imposed in the almost 100 years that they have been legal. And there is a fair possibility that these tariffs could be overturned eventually, but for now they are in place. Now, these tariffs are set to go into effect on August 19th of this year. Canada, in response, went to the negotiating table to see if a deal could be reached to avoid these massive Section 338 tariffs. Now, on August 18th, right, a day before the tariffs were set to go in effect, it seemed like the US and Canada had reached a deal, which prompted the president, again on Truth Social, to announce that he was pausing the implementation of these 50% tariffs for 3 days. So now they are expected to go into effect on August 22nd. And all of that seemed to be good. However, on Friday night, as we know, the trade deal totally collapsed. Now, at the beginning, there was a lot of competing information about what exactly happened. We now know a big part of why these trade talks fell apart came from specifically Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, who at the 11th hour expressed concern that the tariffs on aluminum as well as automobiles were too low. And according to Canadian officials, this effort to backtrack to raise tariff rates on automobiles and aluminum led to Canadian officials walking away from the trade table. Now, a lot of American trade officials have pointed the finger at Canada to say that changes to trade negotiations as it relates to American liquor is what prompted the negotiations to fall apart. What we do know is that in response to these trade talks falling apart, the US instituted a 50% tariff on about 7% of Canadian goods. And in response, Canada and the Prime Minister of Canada instituted retaliatory tariffs on nearly 700 American products. Now, these tariffs, which affect 7% of US imports, include tariffs on things like US seafood products, aluminum, steel, and appliances. And in response, the current administration has threatened additional tariffs if these retaliatory tariffs do not go away. Now, there's a big question about who would be the most likely impacted by this trade war. We can look at the total export percentage and we can see that the total number of US exports to Canada is about 15% of total exports. This contrasts with Canadian exports to the US totaling about 72% of Canadian exports. So it seems like just on its face from these numbers that Canada would be much more heavily impacted by a trade war because a larger percentage of its exports will be impacted by these tariffs. But it's also important to remember that the US is heavily dependent on imports that it exclusively gets from Canada, including things like critical minerals, potash, lumber, auto parts, and crude oil, which is heavily used in the electrical grids for both New York and New England. And while the goods that the US specifically relies on Canada for, things like critical minerals and potash, are not being subjected to tariffs that are being instituted, it's important to keep in mind that Canadian officials have stated that everything is on the table if the US does not continue to threaten the Canadian economy with additional tariffs. In addition, Canadians are very much set on fighting this trade war, with about 76% of Canadian respondents saying that ending the trade talks was a good thing. And I think that's an understated viewpoint of who might win this trade war. There's a lot of support on the Canadian side to support the Canadian economy in light of these tariffs, which contrasts with the US, where there seems to be a lot of opposition to the institution of these repeated tariffs. And again, this is all very interesting given the USMCA talks that are currently happening right now. And there's a real question of whether these trade talks between the US, Canada, and Mexico, how they are going to go, especially given the fact that historically Canada and Mexico are the US's #1 and #2 trading partner. It's a very confusing, unprecedented situation in US trade history and the US economy. But for now, that's all I got. As always, if you have any questions, let me know.